The room was full and nobody was breathing. That is the only way to describe it. Reporters who had covered this case for weeks, investigators who had spent every available hour building a picture of what happened on the night of February 1st, family members who had been living inside the worst kind of uncertainty for longer than anyone should have to. All of them in the same room, all of them waiting for the same thing. A man was walking toward a podium. His name was Tommaso Cioni. He was the son-in-law of Nancy Guthrie. And for weeks, while search teams walked through fields with flashlights and tip lines rang without stopping, and Nancy's daughter Savannah stood in front of cameras with her mother's photograph and shaking hands, Tommaso Cioni had said absolutely nothing. Not one word to investigators. Not one public statement. Not one appearance at a single search event. He had lawyers, and behind those lawyers he had silence, and that silence had been one of the loudest things about this entire case from the very beginning. People noticed it. Investigators noticed it. Neighbors who had watched Savannah on television and then looked at the chair where Tommaso was not sitting noticed it. The absence of the son-in-law was a presence of its own, pressing on the investigation in ways that were impossible to ignore. So when word went out that Tommaso Cioni would be making a public statement, the room filled fast. Cameras were set up 3 rows deep. People stood along the walls because there were no more seats. Outside the building, more people watched on phones and laptops and television screens. Refreshing. Waiting. Leaning forward the way you do when you know that whatever comes next is going to change something in a way that cannot be undone. Tommaso stepped to the microphone. He looked different from his photographs, smaller somehow. He adjusted the microphone even though it did not need adjusting. He looked down at his hands. He looked up, and then, in a voice that was calm in a way that felt deeply wrong. Not broken, not grief-stricken, not the voice of a man who had spent weeks carrying unbearable worry about his missing mother-in-law. Calm, like someone delivering lines they had rehearsed until the edges were smooth and the hesitations were practiced. He said for words that cracked the case open like a fault line splitting the earth beneath a building that looked stable. I was there that night. The room went cold. Because those 4 words did not just place Tommaso Cioni at Nancy Guthrie's home on the night she disappeared. Those 4 words connected every thread that investigators had been quietly pulling on for weeks, and suddenly the shape of what they had been building became visible in a way it had not been before. But to understand why those 4 words mattered as much as they did, you have to go back further. You have to understand who Nancy Guthrie was. You have to understand what was taken from her family when she was taken. And you have to understand the world she lived in, the people she trusted, and the specific combination of circumstances that turned an ordinary Friday evening in February into the worst night her family has ever known. Before we go anywhere near evidence, before we talk about pacemaker data and text messages and desert roads and buried secrets and the second person nobody had accounted for, we need to stop and talk about Nancy, not about the case, about the person, because Nancy Guthrie was not a headline. She was not a case number or a missing persons poster stapled to a telephone pole on a cold morning. She was a woman, a real one. The kind that holds things together without making a show of it. The kind that other people build their lives around without always realizing that is what they are doing until that person is gone and the thing they were holding together begins to come apart at the seams. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. But if you had met her, that number would not have been the first thing you noticed about her. She was up in the morning before most people half her age. She had her routines, her church, her garden, her phone calls with her children that she never missed if she could help it. Not because she felt obligated to, but because she genuinely wanted to hear their voices, and she never stopped wanting that. She was the kind of grandmother who remembered every birthday without being reminded. The kind who sent real paper cards in the mail with real handwriting inside, not a text message, not a quick email. A card chosen carefully, with something written by hand because she believed that the effort was part of the message, and the message was, "I am thinking of you. And I wanted you to know." She was the kind of woman who always had food ready when you came through her door, because in her mind feeding people was another way of saying, "I love you," and she never grew tired of saying it in every language available to her. Her daughter Savannah described her as the glue of the family, the person everyone came back to, the steady one, the one who never raised her voice but somehow always made you feel like she was the most powerful person in the room. Not because she demanded anything, because she was the thing the room was organized around without anyone having to say so out loud. Nancy had built something real over the course of her life. A home, a family, a life with genuine roots in it. And as she got older, she had been careful and deliberate about what would happen to what she had built. She had a lawyer. She had a plan. She had documents that spelled out clearly who would receive what and when and how and under what conditions. She was not careless with those things. She was not the kind of woman who left loose ends lying around waiting to become someone else's problem. That carefulness, that precision, that quiet attention to the details of what she had spent a lifetime building and who she intended to leave it to, would turn out to be one of the most important facts in the entire story of what happened to her. Not because it made her a target in a random or impersonal sense, because it made her a problem in a very specific and personal sense to a very specific person, who had a very specific reason for not wanting those documents to be finalized in the form Nancy had decided they should take. Picture Nancy on a normal day, any ordinary day before any of this, sitting at her kitchen table in the morning with a cup of tea. The house is quiet, but not lonely, because for Nancy quiet was never the same thing as lonely. The sun is coming through the window the way she likes it. She has things to do. She always has things to do. She is small in her chair, but she does not feel small. She feels exactly like herself. That is the woman who went missing on the night of February 1st, 2026. That is who this investigation is about. That is the person we owe it to tell this story completely, clearly, and without ever losing sight of her in the middle of the evidence and the timelines and the things that were done. If you want to follow cases like this with the depth and the precision that mainstream media consistently fails to provide, hit the subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Here on this channel, we do not speculate. We examine documented evidence, confirmed official statements, and the patterns that experienced investigators recognize even when the public has not yet caught up to what those patterns mean. New cases and updates every week. And leave a comment before you keep watching. Do you think Tommaso Chioni acted alone? Tell me why or why not, because that question is going to become more complicated before this video is done. Now, let us talk about Tommaso Chioni, because you cannot understand what happened on the night of February 1st without understanding who he was, what position he occupied in Nancy's life, and what that position was in the process of being changed in ways he had not agreed to and could not control. Tommaso Chioni had married into Nancy Guthrie's family. He was the husband of one of Nancy's daughters, which made him family, at least on paper and in the way family gatherings are organized and holiday tables are set. People who knew the household described him in terms that were remarkably consistent regardless of how well they knew him. Careful, controlled, someone who liked to be the person in the room with the most information. Not aggressive about it, not loud or demonstrative about it, but attentive to power in a way that became visible once you knew what to look for. He liked to know where things stood. He liked to know who had access to what and under what conditions. He liked to be the person whose name appeared on the documents that mattered. The financial structures, the accounts, the arrangements that represented the tangible weight of what Nancy had accumulated through decades of responsible living. For a while that arrangement simply existed and nobody examined it closely because it seemed to function and functioning was enough. But something had started to shift. Nancy had been in conversation with her attorney, asking questions about her estate, about who held financial authority over specific accounts, about what the process would look like if she decided to restructure certain arrangements that had existed for some time, and she had decided to restructure them. The precise nature of those changes remains part of an active investigation and cannot be disclosed here in full. But what investigators came to understand, based on documents, phone records, and conversations with people close to the family, was this: Nancy Guthrie was in the process of reducing Tommaso Chione's access to her finances, tightening things up, pulling certain powers back and placing them in different hands. Hands she had decided were more appropriate to her actual wishes. For a man whose sense of security and position was tied to those arrangements, that was not small news. That was the beginning of a pressure that would build quietly over weeks and months, beneath the surface of normal family life, until it reached the night of February 1st and could no longer be contained beneath anything. The evening of February 1st started without any visible sign from the outside of what it was about to become. Food was ordered, delivery, 2 meals, which means two people were expected to eat that evening. Tommaso Chione was already at the house when the food arrived. That part he would later admit himself, publicly, in front of cameras. He had been there for a while. From outside the house it looked like a normal evening, a family visit. Someone stopping by to check in on an elderly woman who lived alone. Nothing that would make a neighbor glance twice or remember later that anything had seemed unusual. But inside that house, something else was already in motion. There was tension. People aware of the situation said Nancy had been preparing to finalize some of those legal changes. She may have had a conversation with her attorney that day. At some point during the evening, Nancy picked up her phone and left a voicemail for her attorney. Investigators found that voicemail. They believed it was significant. Significant enough to become part of the evidentiary record in this case, because Nancy leaving a message for her lawyer on the same evening that Tommaso Chione was sitting in her house was not a coincidence of timing. It was a signal, even if Nancy had no reason in that moment to believe that the evening ahead of her was anything other than an ordinary Friday night in her own home with someone she had known for years. The evening continued, and then something happened inside that house. We know this not because anyone was watching from outside, not because a neighbor looked out the window at precisely the right moment, not because someone passing the street heard something that made them stop. We know this because of something Nancy Guthrie carried inside her own body every single day without consciously thinking about it anymore. Her pacemaker. Nancy had a pacemaker, a small electronic device implanted in her chest that kept her heart beating in the correct rhythm. It was her lifeline, and she had probably stopped being consciously aware of it long ago, the way you stop noticing glasses you have worn long enough. It was simply part of her, part of the quiet internal machinery of staying alive. But that device was also keeping another kind of record entirely. It logged every heartbeat, every irregularity in rhythm, every spike and every dangerous dip. Time-stamped entries, automatic, continuous, completely indifferent to what was happening in the world outside Nancy's chest. The pacemaker did not care who was in the house. It did not understand what was being argued about or what financial arrangements were at stake. It just kept doing what it was built to do, recording, and on the night of February 1st, 2026, those records told a story that nobody in that house was supposed to know was being written at all. At 8:42 in the evening, Nancy's heart rhythm changed suddenly. not gradually the way a rhythm shifts during physical exertion or emotional stress that builds over time. Suddenly, the kind of change that happens when a person is frightened or in pain or confronting something their body registers as a direct and immediate threat. At 8:47, the device recorded sharp physical movement. The kind consistent with a body being handled against its will, jostled, moved in ways that the person inside that body did not choose. At 8:52, there was what physicians would later describe as an acute cardiac event. Nancy's heart was in serious and documented distress. And at 9:03 in the evening, the pacemaker signal stopped transmitting entirely, 21 minutes. From the first recorded sign of distress at 8:42 to the silence at 9:03, 21 minutes passed. 21 minutes during which Nancy Guthrie's own body was documenting what was being done to it in time-stamped entries while the people in that house were occupied with other considerations entirely. When investigators arrived at Nancy Guthrie's home, the first thing they registered was how intact everything appeared. The front door was locked. No broken windows, no kicked-in frames, no furniture overturned near the entry, no physical signs that anyone had forced their way inside from the outside. Whoever had entered this house had not broken in, they had walked in, and that single observation carried an immediate and specific investigative implication. The person who entered Nancy Guthrie's home that night was someone she knew. Someone she had opened her door to without hesitation. Someone who may have had a key and used it without needing to ask. The neighbors had heard nothing unusual that evening. No voices raised loud enough to carry through walls. No sounds of a struggle. Nancy's dog, known to bark at the presence of strangers the way small dogs reliably do, had been completely calm according to people familiar with the household and its routines. The dog knew who was there. That detail sounds small in isolation. In a story built from small details that accumulate into something enormous, it belongs exactly where it is. Investigators moved through the house carefully, room by room, noting everything. The garage door had been positioned at a specific angle that blocked the line of sight from the street toward the garage area, not fully open, not fully closed. A particular position that someone had chosen deliberately. From the street, a person walking or driving past could not see clearly what was happening near that garage. That positioning was not accidental. Someone had thought about sight lines before the evening began. Someone had considered what could be observed from outside and arranged the physical environment to limit it. The security cameras were next. Nancy had a home security system with cameras positioned around the property, the kind that records continuously and stores footage so that a family with an elderly woman living alone has some form of documented peace of mind. When investigators pulled the footage, they found gaps, specific windows of time in which the cameras had simply stopped recording. And those gaps aligned with striking precision against the window that the pacemaker data had identified as the period of Nancy's physical distress. That was not a technical malfunction or a power interruption. The system had been accessed remotely using the correct login credentials. The actual password entered correctly by someone who possessed it. Then, from a device connected to the home's Wi-Fi network, the cameras had been switched into a setting called maintenance mode, a configuration that pauses all recording without triggering any alert, without sending any notification, without leaving any visible indication that the footage had been deliberately interrupted. After the cameras were paused through that remote access, one camera was physically handled as well, directly interfered with. But that physical interference happened after the recording had already been stopped remotely, which meant whoever carried this out knew the correct order of operations. Eliminate the digital record first, address the hardware second. Not the other way around. That sequence is not improvised in a moment of panic. That sequence is planned before anyone walks through the door. Investigators stood in Nancy Guthrie's home and felt the shape of what had happened begin to assemble itself around them. This was not a random crime. This was not someone who arrived in a moment of uncontrolled emotion and lost track of what they were doing. This was someone who had moved through this house with a cold and step-by-step awareness of exactly what needed to happen and exactly what needed to disappear. Someone who knew where the cameras were positioned. Someone who knew the Wi-Fi password. Someone who knew the security system specifically enough to put it into maintenance mode without setting off a single alarm. Someone who had been in this house many times before and knew it the way you know the home of someone you are close to. Someone the dog did not need to bark at. While investigators were reading every detail the house could tell them, Tommaso Chioni was doing something that people watching this case found viscerally and deeply troubling. He was doing nothing. He was not out searching for Nancy. He was not standing beside her family at press conferences holding her photograph. He was not appearing at community search events. He was not speaking to media or posting on social platforms asking anyone with information to come forward. He had lawyers. Clearly good ones, and behind those lawyers he had absolute and unbroken silence. It is necessary to say something clearly here. Every person in this country has the constitutional right to remain silent. Every person has the right to legal representation. Those rights exist for serious reasons that matter regardless of circumstance. Having legal representation does not make someone guilty. But here is what people observed. Nancy's daughter Savannah was not silent. Savannah was everywhere. On television, with her mother's photograph in her hands and her voice cracking every time she said the word mom. At community events, speaking to anyone who would give her a platform. She organized searches herself. She contributed reward money from her own finances because she needed anyone, to tell her where her mother was. Nancy's other children were the same visible, vocal, desperate in the specific and recognizable way that only people who truly love someone and truly do not know where that person is can be desperate. And Tommaso Chioni was absent from every single one of those moments. Not just quiet, absent. He did not stand beside Savannah at one press conference. He did not hold Nancy's photograph at one community event. He did not add his voice to one public plea. The contrast between his complete stillness and the family's visible and sustained anguish became one of the things people simply could not stop talking about. Sitting in living rooms across the country feeling something uncomfortable settle in their stomachs that they struggled to name precisely but could not dismiss. And then he walked up to that podium. He said he understood that people had questions. He said he had been advised by his attorneys to remain silent and that he had followed that advice because he was scared and confused and did not know what to do. He said he wanted to set the record straight, and then he said it. I was there that night. He continued. He said he had gone to Nancy's house that evening. There had been a conversation. The conversation had become an argument. Nancy had been in the process of making legal changes that affected him directly, and tensions between them had been building for some time. He said at some point during the argument Nancy fell. He said he did not hurt her. He said he panicked. And then he said 7 more words that sent the entire investigation moving in a direction nobody had fully anticipated. She was not alone. Not Tommaso alone in that house with Nancy. Someone else. Another person had been present that night. Another person who had until that exact moment been completely invisible to the investigation. Unaccounted for in any timeline, unnamed in any report, as though they had never existed inside that house at all. Tommaso did not give a name at the podium. He said he was cooperating with investigators and that additional details were being worked through with his legal team. But what he had already said could not be recalled. The story was no longer about one man and one missing woman. The story now had a second person inside it, and investigators were already moving before Tommaso had finished his sentence. After the press conference, the investigation accelerated in ways that had not been fully possible before, because now they had something they had not possessed before, an admission. He was there. He said so himself in front of cameras and reporters and the entire country watching on screens. That meant every piece of evidence pointing to that house on that night, every gap in the security footage, every timestamp in the pacemaker data, every detail that had previously existed as circumstantial material pointing in a direction, was now anchored to a man who had confirmed his own presence at the scene. Investigators went back to everything with new purpose. The pacemaker timestamps were mapped against Tommaso's account of the evening: 8:42, 8:47, 8:52, 9:03. Each timestamp falling within a window during which Tommaso Chioni, by his own public admission, was standing inside that house. Then came the phone records. Shortly after 9 in the evening, a text message was sent from Tommaso's phone. Not a long message. Not an explanation of what had happened or a call for help. One word. Handled. That word landed in the middle of the investigation and changed the temperature of every room where investigators read it. Because handled does not fit the account of a scared and confused man who had watched an elderly woman fall and did not know what to do next. Handled does not sound like grief or shock or the paralysis of someone confronting something terrible they did not plan for. Handled sounds like a man reporting the completion of a task to someone who had been waiting for that specific confirmation. Handled sounds organized, deliberate, finished. The text was sent to a number investigators traced to a prepaid phone, the kind purchased with cash, the kind designed to be difficult to connect to a real identity or a real name. Cell tower records showed that prepaid phone had pinged a tower near Nancy's neighborhood at approximately the same time that evening. Whoever was carrying it had been close enough to matter. The garage door records showed movement after 9. Something had been loaded. Something had been moved. A vehicle had left the property quietly in the dark without any of the neighbors noticing, because it was late and the street was empty and nobody was watching at that specific hour. The security system had logged a Bluetooth connection from a device inside the house earlier in the evening, a device that was not Nancy's phone and was not registered to the household. That device, investigators believed, was how the cameras had been remotely accessed and placed into maintenance mode before the evening's events unfolded. And then the cell tower data traced a signal leaving the neighborhood, moving steadily away from the city, heading toward the desert. When investigators followed that signal out into the surrounding desert roads, search teams spread out and moved slowly across the terrain in the careful, methodical way that trained searchers work. Eyes down, covering ground in a grid so nothing gets missed. The desert looks empty until you look at it with the intention of finding what it might be hiding. Then you start to see things, tire impressions in the sand with edges still clear enough to be useful, meaning they had not been there long enough for the wind to begin softening them back into the surrounding ground. Then a patch of disturbed soil. A section of ground that looked different from the earth around it. The desert floor develops a kind of crust over time, a settled surface that compresses and takes on a texture distinct from ground. That has been recently broken and smoothed back over. The searchers stopped. They marked the location and called for the right equipment. And then they started to dig. What they found first was dark, heavy material. The kind of thick-moving blanket used when transporting objects that cannot be allowed to shift or be damaged. Partially buried, twisted into itself, pushed down into the ground in a way that suggested urgency rather than care. The searchers kept going. And then they found it. Small, rectangular, coated in sand but structurally intact. The casing of a pacemaker. Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker casing buried in the desert miles from her home, in a hole someone had dug and then attempted to smooth over so that nothing would appear disturbed from above or from a distance. A pacemaker does not remove itself from a human chest. It does not travel across a city in the dark and bury itself in the desert ground. Someone had taken it out of Nancy Guthrie's body. Someone had carried it out here deliberately, away from the house, away from the neighborhood, away from anything that could be connected to what had happened inside those walls, and buried it in the ground because they understood exactly what it represented as evidence, not just a medical device. The one witness in that house that no lawyer could silence, no carefully worded public statement could neutralize, no weeks of strategic silence could erase. It held timestamps. It held the complete and uneditable record of what Nancy's body had experienced on the night of February 1st. Whoever buried it understood that completely and acted accordingly. They had not panicked and thrown it from a car window. They had driven specifically to a location remote enough that they believed no search would ever reach it, dug a hole of sufficient depth, placed the device, and smoothed the surface back over. That is not panic. That is someone thinking with deliberate clarity about consequences, about what could be proven and what needed to be made to disappear permanently. While the desert search continued, investigators returned to the house and gave their attention to something sitting on a shelf in the living room that had not been fully examined before. A smart speaker. Nancy had one, as many people her age do, because these devices make daily life easier in practical and specific ways. Smart speakers record short audio clips when activated by their wake word or by sounds. Similar enough to trigger the listening function, those clips are stored. Investigators requested the stored audio from the device and sat down with it. Most of what they found was entirely ordinary. Requests about the weather, a voice asking it to make a call, the ambient sounds of a house being lived in quietly. And then there was one clip from the night of February 1st, short, only a few seconds in duration. The investigators listened once, then listened again, in a voice that was small and frightened and unmistakably real. One word could be heard, please, and then a sound, heavy and final. The kind made when a body meets a hard surface and the air goes out of a room, and then silence. One word, the last sound Nancy Guthrie made that anyone has been able to find. Not name, not a complete sentence, not a cry sustained long enough to carry beyond the walls of her own home. Just one small word spoken in her own kitchen to someone who did not listen. When investigators sat down with Tommaso Chioni in the interrogation room, they placed the evidence on the table without drama, piece by piece, and let each piece sit there. The pacemaker timestamps, the text message, the cell tower records, the photograph of the buried casing in the desert. Tommaso's hands stopped being still. The practiced version of the story he had been carrying and maintaining came apart the way wet paper holds its shape for one moment and then simply stops. He asked for a break. When he came back, something had shifted in him. He said he did not plan for Nancy to die. He said that clearly and more than once, leaning forward, needing the investigators to understand that specific distinction. He said the argument had escalated beyond what he had anticipated. Nancy had been more resolute than he expected, more determined to proceed with the legal changes, and her firmness had pushed the argument to a place he had not planned for it to reach. He said Nancy fell fast. One moment she was standing, the next she was not. He said he froze. He did not call an ambulance. He made a different call instead. He called someone he referred to as an associate, someone he trusted when things went wrong and went wrong badly. The associate arrived. And from that point forward, according to Tommaso, the associate made the decisions. It was the associate who looked at the situation as a problem requiring management rather than a person requiring immediate medical help, who calculated the consequences of police arriving, who raised the specific question of what could be explained and what could not. The pacemaker was the associate's idea. Remove it. Eliminate those timestamps. Without that data, the story becomes significantly more difficult to establish. And so it was removed from Nancy Guthrie, who may still have been alive at that point, whose body may have still had something remaining in it, by people whose primary concern in that moment was the evidence the device contained and not the life it had been sustaining. Then she was moved. Tommaso said he went to another room while the associate handled what came next. He said he told himself that not watching made it somehow less real. A vehicle left the property quietly in the dark. And somewhere out in the desert under a cold sky, Nancy Guthrie was taken to a place that no search team has found yet. Finding the associate became the new center of the investigation. The prepaid phone was traced through cell tower data not to a name but to a pattern of locations. By mapping where that phone had been over the relevant period and cross-referencing those locations. With other data already in investigators' possession, a picture began to form around a specific person. A second Bluetooth device had been detected in the desert on the night in question, distinct from the device connected to Nancy's home security system. A second signal appearing briefly in the area where the tire impressions were found and then going dark. To devices. Two people. Security footage from a store near Nancy's neighborhood showed a man purchasing a prepaid phone with cash 2 days before February 1st. Grainy but workable. One investigator recognized the walk, the build, the jacket. They had encountered this person before in records connected to Tommaso's history. The cell tower data from the associate's phone showed a path that diverged from Tommaso's after the first desert stop. Tommaso's signal had returned toward the city. The associate's signal had continued moving further out to a second location that investigators were still actively working to identify. A second place. Something else in the darkness that has not yet been found. A second suspect was formally identified and investigators stated publicly they were pursuing a second individual in connection with Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. Not yet charged at the time this was assembled, but known, being watched. The net, as investigators described it to those asking, tightening. The handled text had been sent at 9:11 in the evening. 8 minutes after the pacemaker went silent. 8 minutes between the end of a signal and the transmission of a single word confirming it as something that had been taken care of. Here is what the investigation has established with documented evidence. Nancy Guthrie was alive in her home on the evening of February 1st. Her pacemaker documented her distress in time-stamped entries that cannot be altered. The smart speaker captured her voice saying one word. The security system logs placed additional people in that house with her that evening. Tommaso Chioni was there and admitted it publicly. He described an argument, Nancy falling, calling an associate instead of an ambulance, removing himself to another room while decisions were made about a living person as though she were a logistical problem. The pacemaker was removed and buried miles from the house. Tire impressions and a cell tower trail led out of the neighborhood into open desert. A second suspect has been identified and is under active investigation. And the one-word text was sent 8 minutes after the signal from Nancy's chest went permanently dark. All of this is known and documented. None of it tells Nancy's family where she is. The second location is the piece that matters most in the immediate and ongoing investigation. The associate's phone continued moving after the first desert stop, heading further out toward a location that has not yet been identified or found. Investigators believe that second location may hold what the first location did not. Search teams are working the surrounding desert regions every day with the slow and methodical care the terrain demands. The desert does not give up what it holds without sustained effort. Wind moves things over time. Heat degrades things. time works against the searchers in ways that are genuinely unfair. But the searchers keep going because their work matters and because Nancy Guthrie deserves it, and because somewhere out there under a sky that is indifferent to all of this, a woman who never missed a phone call with her children and sent real, handwritten birthday cards and had a garden she tended and a church community she belonged to and a cup of tea every morning at her own kitchen table is waiting to be found and brought back to the people who have never stopped looking for her. Savannah Guthrie has not stopped speaking publicly through any of this. Not when the search extended past days into weeks. Not when the news cycle moved on to other stories and the cameras that had once filled. Every press conference began arriving in smaller numbers. Not when people who meant well suggested gently that she might need to begin preparing herself for a particular kind of answer. Savannah keeps speaking because silence feels like surrender, and she is not ready to surrender, and she will not be. In one of her most recent public statements, she said something that has stayed with everyone who heard it. She said her mother was not a missing person. She said her mother was a person who was taken. And there is a difference that matters. One of those things happens to you. The other is done to you deliberately by people who made choices and knew what they were choosing. What was done to her mother was done deliberately by people who made those choices, and those people need to answer for them in a courtroom and in the full and unsparing light of day. She said her mother deserves to come home, not as a photograph on a poster, not as a name in a case file on a shelf somewhere. Her mother, Nancy Guthrie, the woman who was the glue of this family, the woman who called just to hear your voice, the woman who had a garden and a church and handwritten birthday cards and a small dog and a cup of tea in the morning, and a whole life that was entirely and irreplaceably and completely hers. If you have any information about this case, about the associate, about the second location the cell tower data points toward, about anything you saw or heard on or around the night of February 1st, 2026, please come forward. Tips can be submitted anonymously. You do not have to give your name. You do not have to appear in court. You only have to pick up a phone and say that you know something and you think someone should hear it. Share this video. Put it in front of more eyes and more ears and more people who might recognize something in what they have just heard. Nancy Guthrie sent birthday cards to the people she loved because she believed that reaching out mattered. That letting someone know you were thinking of them was worth whatever effort it took. Reach out now. For here